So we're on the home stretch of our series on the Patriarchs. So next week we're gonna finish. Yep, kids, you can be dismissed. Sorry. Next week we're gonna conclude the series. This is a series we've been in since April. We've been looking at the stories from the lives of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, and so we've been in Joseph for the story of Joseph for the past few weeks. And where we left off, Joseph was forgotten. He was left in prison. This was a couple of weeks ago. So how did Joseph get there? Most of us are familiar with the story of Joseph, especially if we've grown up in the church. We know about Joseph's story, but let's be reminded. I'm just going to summarize where we've been, review a little bit, and then we'll move forward. Joseph is given a coat by his father Jacob, which means that he was probably put in charge, that he was overseeing his brothers, which is a problem because his brothers were older than him. Given the coat probably means that he will be receiving the birthright as well, the double portion of his father's estate at some point in his life. And on top of that, he gives his father a bad report about his brothers. They're ticked, they're upset, they can't really stand Joseph. And on top of all that, Joseph has these dreams in which his brothers are bowing down to him, and he shares it with them. They're jealous, they're angry, they hate their brother, they throw him in a pit, they sell him to some slave traders on their way to Egypt. They dip his coat in blood, present it to their father, deceiving him into believing that his favorite son, Joseph, has been eaten by a wild animal. When Joseph arrives in Egypt, he's purchased by Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials. But we discover that God was with Joseph, and this is a big deal. We looked at this a couple of weeks ago. God was with Joseph in the ups and downs, in the hills and the valleys of life. God was with Joseph. Joseph finds favor in the eyes of Potiphar. Potiphar puts him in charge of his entire household. And God blesses Potiphar and blesses Potiphar's household through Joseph. We then find out that Potiphar's wife takes notice of Joseph. And after several unsuccessful attempts to get Joseph to sleep with her, she falsely accuses Joseph of taking advantage of her, strips him of his coat as proof, shows it to her husband, Potiphar. And the fact that Potiphar doesn't have Joseph put to death right on the spot because he's just a slave shows it's probably an indication that he trusts Joseph. He doesn't really trust his wife. He believes Joseph. He doesn't believe his wife, but he has to do something. So instead of putting Joseph to death, he puts Joseph in prison. Where once again, in prison, we find out that God was with Joseph. Once again, Joseph finds favor in the eyes of the prison warden, is put in charge, and finds success in whatever he does in the prison. Now, sometime later, the cupbearer and the baker offend Pharaoh, and they're put in the same prison as Joseph. And some time passes, and the cupbearer and the baker have dreams. And they're disturbed by these dreams. They don't know what these dreams could mean. God gives Joseph the meaning. God gives Joseph the interpretation, and he shares it with the cupbearer and the baker. And just as Joseph predicted, the baker is put to death by Pharaoh. It's bad news for him. But good news for the cupbearer, because the cupbearer is going to be restored to his position with Pharaoh, and that's exactly what happens. And so this is kind of good news for Joseph too, or at least he thinks it's good news, because he's hoping that at this point that the cupbearer can put in a good word for him and get him out of prison. But he doesn't. He forgets all about Joseph, and for 2 whole years, Joseph is left in prison. And that's where we left off a couple of weeks ago. So today we're going to pick up the story from there, and we're going to continue. And usually I don't do this, but we're going to actually cover 40. We're going to cover chapters 41 through 46 as I summarize this story of Joseph, the next part of the story of Joseph. And once again, most of you are familiar with the story. That's why I just want to summarize what's happening, and we'll learn a couple key points here. But I want to encourage you to read this on your own. Open up to Genesis sometime this afternoon, sometime this week. Read it with your family. Read it with your community group. Be reminded of the story of Joseph and what some of the takeaways are. So far in the life of Joseph, we've seen kind of this general pattern. Dreams, coat, pit. Dreams, coat, pit. Dreams, coat, pit. So at the beginning of his story, Joseph has some dreams. His brothers don't like it. His brothers don't like him. They strip him of his coat. They throw him in a pit. In Potiphar's house, Potiphar's wife has dreams, so to speak, of sleeping with Joseph. Joseph refuses. She doesn't like it. She strips him of his coat. He's thrown into a pit, into the prison. And so now, today, as we continue the story, we see Pharaoh has some dreams. Uh-oh. Here we go again. Here we go again. But not this time. The pattern changes. Pharaoh has these dreams. No one can tell him the meaning of the dreams. But the cupbearer finally remembers Joseph. Hey, there was this guy who told me what my dreams meant. Pharaoh, maybe this guy who's in prison can help you with your dream. So Pharaoh calls for Joseph. And I want to read from Genesis chapter 41 at verse 15. Pharaoh said to Joseph, I had a dream, and no one can interpret it, but I've heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. I cannot do it, Joseph said. But God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires. And this is pretty remarkable. No matter what Joseph has been going through, all the junk he's been going through, he continually points the way to God. God will give you. And God once again gives Joseph the meaning of the dreams. Pharaoh likes Joseph, has the coat, the royal robe placed upon Joseph. He's not stripped of a coat this time. And Joseph is elevated. He's pulled from the pit once and for all, and he's put in charge. He's elevated to second in command of all of Egypt. At just the right time, in just the right place for God to further his plan. And we'll talk more about that in a bit. Now, as many of you know, the interpretation that Joseph has given for Pharaoh's dreams is that there would be 7 years of abundance in the land, followed by 7 years of terrible famine. Joseph also provides Pharaoh with a plan to stockpile reserves of grain during the good years in order to provide enough grain during the years of famine. And so Joseph is put in charge to implement that plan. And once the 7 years of famine hit, we read in chapter 41, verses 56 and 57, when the famine had spread over the whole country, Joseph opened up all the storehouses and sold grain to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe throughout Egypt, and all the world came to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph because the famine was severe everywhere. All the world came to Joseph. Joseph had become the blessing to the entire world, the blessing to all the earth as God intended for Abraham's family, right? Which will one day ultimately become the reality through Jesus. Well, the famine is so widespread that it's affected Jacob's family all the way up in the land of Canaan. And so Joseph's brothers, all except Benjamin, traveled to Egypt to buy some grain. Chapter 42 now, verse 6, it says, Now Joseph was the governor of the land, the person who sold grain to all his people. So when Joseph's brothers arrived, they bowed down to him with their faces to the ground. They bowed down to him, just as he had dreamed about so many years ago, right? Joseph recognizes his brothers right away, but they don't recognize him. So Joseph begins implementing these tests with his brothers to see if they're the same old brothers that he once knew, or if they'd changed. Had they changed at all? Are they sorry? So his first test, he accuses them of being spies. He throws them into prison. And in order for them to prove they're not, he tells them that they can return home with the grain that they've purchased, but Simeon would have to stay. Simeon would have to stay in prison until they returned with their youngest brother, Benjamin. That's not going to happen, right? Joseph sends them on their way and secretly has their silver, the silver that was supposed to pay for the grain, put back into their packs. They return home. They realize they didn't pay for the grain. They're in big trouble now. There's no way they can return to Egypt now, and there's no way that Jacob is going to allow them to return to Egypt with his beloved son Benjamin. He's not willing to lose another favorite son. Well, a long time passes. Their food runs out, and they become desperate. But they know they can't return for more grain unless Benjamin goes with them. They're in such desperation, such a great need, that Judah steps up and finally convinces Jacob. We're going to come back to Judah here in a second. He finally convinces Jacob to allow them to take Benjamin. And here's what Jacob says in chapter 43 at verse 11. Then their father, Israel, or Jacob, said to them, "If it must be, then do it. Put some of the best products of the land in your bags and take them down to the man as a gift. A little balm and a little honey, some spices and myrrh, some pistachio nuts and almonds. Take double the amount of silver with you, for you must return the silver that was put back in the mouths of your sacks. Perhaps it was a mistake. Take your brother also and go back to the man at once. And may God Almighty grant you mercy before the man, so that he will let your older brother and Benjamin come back with you. As for me, if I am bereaved, I am bereaved." So he sends the brothers back. When they arrive to Egypt the second time, Joseph surprisingly has them taken into his home, and there's a meal prepared for them. And they're scared. They don't know what's happening. What's going on? What's going to happen to them? And they bow down to Joseph once again. And then in chapter 43, verse 29, it says, and he looked about. This is Joseph. He saw his brother Benjamin, his own mother's son. He asked, is this your youngest brother, the one you told me about? And he said, "God be gracious to you, my son." Deeply moved at the sight of his brothers, Joseph hurried out and looked for a place to weep. He went into his private room and wept there. After he had washed his face, he came out, controlling himself, and said, "Serve the food." They served him by himself, the brothers by themselves, and the Egyptians who ate with him by themselves, because the Egyptians could not eat with Hebrews, for that is detestable to the Egyptians. The men had been seated before him in order of their ages, from the firstborn to the youngest, and they looked at each other in astonishment. When portions were served to them from Joseph's table, Benjamin's portion was 5 times as much as anyone else's. So they feasted, and they ate, and they drank freely with him. So Joseph is testing his brothers again. Will his brothers act jealously towards Benjamin as they did with him so many years ago? But there's another test to come. This time when his brothers are sent back to Canaan, Joseph instructs his steward to fill the brothers' packs with grain along with their silver once again, and then he instructs his steward to place his special cup in Benjamin's pack. Soon after the brothers have left Egypt, they're overtaken by the steward of Joseph's house, accusing them of stealing Joseph's special cup. And of course, the brothers insist that they haven't taken the cup. In fact, they say, if you find the cup in any of our packs, you can put the person to death who stole it, and then take us as slaves for the rest of our lives. The steward says, "Nah, I'll just make the person who stole the cup a slave, and the rest of you can go free." So the search is made, and of course Joseph's cup is found in Benjamin's pack. Now, how are the brothers going to respond? How will they respond to this? They can give up another brother as a slave to Egypt, save their own skins. They don't have to stick around. They can head home. They can take off if they want. And as difficult as it would be, they They could take another disturbing report back to their father like they did with Joseph. They have a choice to make. And it seems pretty obvious what the brothers Joseph knew would do, because they did it to him. But what would they do now? Chapter 44, verse 13. At this, they tore their clothes. Then they all loaded their donkeys and returned to the city. They returned with Benjamin. They didn't have to go back. They could be set free. They could have gone home, but they returned to Egypt with Benjamin. They bowed down to Joseph for a third time, and Judah gives this really long speech to Joseph. And I'm going to read it here. This is Judah speaking here. And a few weeks ago, we learned about Judah's story. Not a very, very good story. A pretty evil story. But this is from Judah. I mean, he's the one whose idea it was to sell Joseph in the first place as a slave 13 years prior. He's probably the leader of the pack when bringing Joseph's bloody coat to their father. Shows a complete disregard for Joseph, complete disregard for the feelings of their father. But here's what Judah says, chapter 44, starting with verse 18. Then Judah went up to Joseph and said, "Pardon your servant, my lord. Let me speak a word to my lord. Do not be angry with your servant, though you are equal to Pharaoh himself." My lord asked his servants, do you have a father or a brother? And we answered, "We have an aged father, and there's a young son born to him in his old age. His brother is dead. He's the only one of my mother's sons left, and his father loves him. Then you said to your servants, 'Bring him down to me, so I can see him for myself.' And we said to my lord, 'The boy cannot leave his father. If he leaves him, his father will die.' But you told your servants, 'Unless your youngest brother comes down with you, you will not see my face again.' When we went back to your servant, my father, we told him what my lord has said. Then our father said, 'Go back and buy a little more food.' But we said, 'We cannot go down. Only if our youngest brother is with us will we go. We cannot see the man's face unless our youngest brother is with us.' Your servant, my father, said to us, 'You know that my wife bore me 2 sons. One of them went away from me.' And I said, he's surely been torn to pieces. And I have not seen him since. If you take this one from me too, and harm comes to him, you will bring my gray head down to the grave in misery. So now, if the boy is not with us when I go back to your servant, my father, and if my father, whose life is so closely bound up with the boy's life, sees that the boy isn't there, he will die. Your servants will bring the gray head of our father down to the grave in sorrow. Your servant guaranteed the boy's safety to my father. I said, if I do not bring him back to you, I will bear the blame before you, my father, all my life. Now then, please let your servant remain here as my lord's slave in place of the boy, and let the boy return with his brothers. How can I go back to my father if the boy is not with me? No, do not let me see the misery that would come on my father." And this is when Joseph knew his brothers had changed, especially Judah. They want to protect their younger brother this time. They want to spare their father from grief this time. They've changed. They've changed. And so one of the things that I think we need to be reminded of today, I know I need to be reminded of this. I need to be continually reminded of this, and maybe you do as well. God transforms hearts. God transforms hearts. Do you believe that? Do you really believe that? God transforms hearts. Even jealous, angry, deceiving hearts. Even the most evil of hearts. But it often takes time. And it's often a lifelong process, but God transforms hearts. And in this story of Joseph, it wasn't just the brothers, and especially Judah's heart that we see right here in this portion of the story, but Joseph's heart as well. I mean, think about this. Joseph probably wouldn't have become the man that he was had he not gone through what he had gone through. I mean, Joseph experienced some pretty difficult things in his life at a very young age, right? That could have very easily caused him to pull away from God. We see that all the time, right? Difficult things in life. People moving away from God. How could there really be a God if I'm experiencing something like this? All the junk that he had to go through could have made him a bitter, angry, vindictive person. We see that all the time too, don't we? I don't think any of us would have blamed Joseph, right? I don't think any of us would have blamed Joseph if he wanted to get back at his brothers. You know? If he wanted to take revenge, I don't think any of us would have blamed him for it because they had it coming to them. I mean, look at all that he had to experience. 13 years. They had it coming. Here's how Joseph responds to them. Chapter 45, starting with verse 1. Then Joseph could no longer control himself before all his attendants, and he cried out, "Have everyone leave my presence." So there was no one with Joseph when he made himself known to his brothers. And he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard him. And Pharaoh's household heard about it. Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still living?" But his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified at his presence. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "Come close to me." When they had done so, he said, "I am your brother, Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt." He doesn't say, "Oh, don't worry about it. It's not a big deal. You know, everything's good now." No, he says, you sold me into slavery in Egypt. You were the ones. I'm the one that you sold into slavery. You did this. That was a big deal. What you did was evil. But then he immediately offers grace and forgiveness. And the very next verses I want to put up on the screen. We read these words. Joseph continues, "And now do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now there have been famine in the land, and for the next 5 years there will be no plowing and reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance." In the midst of everything that Joseph went through, you know, I'm sure he struggled. I'm sure he struggled big time. I'm sure he had lots of questions, and I'm sure he had lots of doubts. And there's really no way that he understood why God would allow all of that to happen to him, why he had to go through all of that. But looking back on it, he now sees. He now knows. He was a part of something bigger than himself. God was not only using all that Joseph went through to transform his life, to transform his brothers' lives, but God was up to something even bigger than all of that. God was using it all for a greater purpose. And so here's Joseph, 13 years later, in just the right place, at just the right time, to be a part of the saving of lives, to be a part of preserving a remnant of the covenant family of God, and to be a part of a great deliverance. A great deliverance. And so in the next chapter, in chapter 46, we read that Jacob and all the rest of the family traveled to Egypt in order to survive the famine and to reunite with Joseph. And on their way, Jacob has another encounter with God. And I want to read that too in chapter 46, starting with verse 1. So Israel set out with all that was his, and when he reached Beersheba, he offered sacrifices to the God of his father Isaac. And God spoke to Israel in a vision that night and said, "Jacob, Jacob." "Here I am," he replied. "I am God, the God of your father," he said. "Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for I will make you into a great nation there. I am the God of your father." Jacob, remember, I'm the God of your father. I'm the God of Isaac. And remember, I'm the God of Abraham. Remember, you're connected to something way bigger than just yourself. You're a part of this big plan, this big covenant plan of God. You're a part of this plan to bring blessing to the entire world, to all the nations. That's what you're a part of, Jacob. And so Jacob's family arrives in Egypt, where they begin to grow, where Israel will thrive and flourish, where they will be fruitful and multiply, which sets the stage for the great deliverance some 400 years later, when God delivers. God rescues the people of Israel who will be enslaved in Egypt, which sets the stage for an even greater deliverance, an even greater rescue, the ultimate deliverance some 1,500 years later, when Jesus steps on the scene, the great deliverer of mankind. You see, there was a bigger context for Jacob's story. There was a bigger context for Joseph's story. There was a bigger context for Judah and Tamar and all the brothers, a bigger context for all their stories. And I think we need to be reminded as well that there's a bigger context for our stories. There's a bigger context for the lives that we live. We're connected to a bigger story. We need to be reminded of that on a daily basis. We are connected to a bigger story. There's a greater purpose for our lives. God's directing all the moving parts. He's taking all the pieces of the puzzle, the good pieces, the bad pieces, the evil that's been done to us, the evil that we've done to others, the evil that we've done to ourselves. He's taking all of that. He's putting it all together, and he's using it for a greater purpose, a greater purpose. So for those of us who put our trust in Jesus, we're connected to a bigger story. And listen, it's difficult to see. It's so easy to forget, especially in the midst of the everyday circumstances of life, right? When we're right in the thick of it, it's easy to forget. We're part of a bigger story. We are a part of something big that God has been accomplishing throughout history, and he's continuing to accomplish in our world today. We're a part of that. We're a part of that. And so next week, we're going to conclude the story of Joseph. We're going to conclude our Patriarchs series, which we've been in since April. We're going to conclude it by looking at this big story, this big picture. What is this big story? And what's the greater purpose that God has been up to? What's that all about? Pray with me. God, thank you so much for your word. Thank you so much for just allowing us to be together this morning, spend time in your word, spend time in prayer, spend time worshiping you. And I pray that this will not be in vain, that you'll take this and use this for your honor and for your glory, so that as we leave this place this morning and we leave these doors, that we can be a blessing to the people in our lives. We can point the way to you. And we're grateful that we can be a part of that. In Jesus' name, amen. I want to remind you of Judah's words to Joseph. Your servant guaranteed the boy's safety to my father. I said, if I do not bring him back to you, I will bear the blame before you, my father, all my life. Now then, please let your servant remain here as my Lord's slave in place of the boy, and let the boy return with his brothers. Judah said, I'll bear the blame. I'll bear the guilt. Let Benjamin go free. And that's exactly what happened to Judah's great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandson some 37 generations later, if I'm getting the math correct. Jesus gave himself in our place, bearing our guilt so that we could go free. And that's what we want to celebrate this morning as we take the bread and the cup. This morning, as I was reading in Hebrews, some of you are following along on our all-church Bible reading plan. We've been reading through the entire New Testament this year. We're in Hebrews chapter 2. And what we read this morning was very relevant to this, and I want us to read this together. Will you read it with me? Since the children have flesh and blood, he too shared in their humanity, so that by his death he might break the power of him who holds the power of death, that is the devil, and free those who all their lives were held in slavery by their fear of death. So let's take the bread and be reminded of Jesus' body that was broken for us so that we could go free. And let's be reminded of his blood that was shed so that our sins could be